One fun note about this particular chapbook, I don't know if the camera will catch it. There's a little string right here. My wife saddle stitched this because testing it. I wanted to see like really what it would feel and look like. And she was watching me work and struggle with a stapler. And she's like, let me just saddle stitch that real fast.
Welcome to Cardboard Creations, where we discuss the process, techniques, and inspiration for designing board games. I'm your host, Candice Harris, and I'm super excited to be here today with Cole Wehrle to find out how Root was created. But first, let's jump into a quick overview of how Root works. Root is a game of adventure and war in which 2 to 4 players battle for control of the vast woodland. Each player plays one of 4 asymmetric factions, and each faction scores victory points in its own way and has its own unique style of gameplay. The Marquis de Cat exploit the resources of the woodland to create an industrial and military powerhouse. They score by constructing new buildings and crafts. The Erie dynasties strive to reclaim the glory of their once great aristocracy and retake the woodland from the cats. They score each turn by building and protecting roosts in the woodland. The Woodland Alliance wish to unite the creatures of the forest and rise up against their oppressors. They score by spreading sympathy for their cause across the woodland. Meanwhile, the Vagabond plays all sides of the conflict for their own gain and scores by completing quests for the creatures of the woodland and by both aiding and harming the other factions. The game board for Root features a map of the woodland, and this is where most of the action unfolds. You can use paths to move around the map from clearing to clearing, you can construct buildings, and you can battle other players. Throughout the game, you draw cards from a shared deck into your hand, and these cards can be used in a variety of ways. Many cards can be crafted to gain various immediate or persistent effects. You can use ambush cards to surprise opponents at the start of a battle, and many actions in Root require you to spend different types of cards from your hand. Each player's turn is split into 3 phases: birdsong, daylight, and evening. What you do during each of these phases depends on the faction you are playing. Once you play through these phases in order, your turn ends, and the next player begins their turn. Players continue taking turns in clockwise order until someone wins the game, either by scoring 30 points or by playing and completing a dominance card. Hey Cole, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Candice.
Yeah, so what initially inspired you to create Root?
So Root is a game with a really interesting history. It brought together a bunch of different creative strands. So it was designed and developed by myself and the rest of the staff here at Leader Games in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we build games a little differently than the normal model. You know, usually games come to be a lot like a book comes to be. You know, you work on a game for a long time, and then you find the right people, they connect you with a publisher, and you kind of go through a publication process. And with Root, I had been working on some questions, some ideas around accessible war games for a while, but the game didn't really start until Patrick Leader, the owner of the company, presented me with a little outline for an asymmetric strategy game. And I looked at it and started thinking about how to apply some of the things I was working on to this design prompt. And I started thinking about some of the genres that I really liked, like Voko Runke's coin games and just a lot of other titles in that space. And when I looked at all those things together, I thought, okay, I think I have a way that I can take the asymmetric formula that Patrick and David Somerville used for Vast, and I can apply it to kind of the wargaming space. And from there, the whole thing just kind of exploded into view. I mean, it's one of the things about Root that was shocking to me. It wasn't the first game I had worked on, but it came together very, very fast. I think it took about a month and a half from concept to like the first, like we were playing something that was recognizably Root. And that's partly because of the game's position. It was trying to sort of make established genres accessible. So I could look and see, like, how does Andean Abyss work?
Yeah.
Where are the points of tension in Andean Abyss? And is there a way I can take those points of tension and put them in a different context? And it also has to do with the fact that I was blending together design ideas that have been incubating for a really, really long time. But the thing that I always just want to underline about the creation of Root is that it was so collaborative. And it was basically spearheaded by Patrick, who had the initial concept, and then myself, who did the design work and the early graphic design, and then our artist, Kyle Farron, who did the vast majority of the world building and a lot of the look of the game. And we were all working in close concert for those early days.
That's so cool. Yeah, I was kind of wondering, because I knew that there was some coin inspiration in Root, but I was kind of wondering if there were any particular games that you were playing, any particular coin games, or any other games like that you either previously designed or just something that you were playing that was kind of inspiring it a bit.
I think I'm a pretty argumentative designer, for better or worse. Usually when I play games, I will always have like little critiques of them. And so I'll be playing a game and thinking like, oh, I would have done this differently, or I don't know if this works quite as well as it should. And I never mean it to be mean. I think about it like being in a writer's workshop or something, right? Where I sort of see all of design that's happening is a conversation, and I want to participate in that conversation, and I want to help others have better voices, and I want other people to help me have a better voice. And so, when I was thinking about this project and the challenge of making an accessible war game, one of the things that I looked at were all of the games that have like conflict themes. And I looked at a really wide swath, because the challenge of making like a lighter Risk or like a lighter Dune, these are very like old challenges that are very long standing in the field. And I think about like kind of lesser known fantasy flight games like Dust, which was trying to do, what would Risk look like if it were designed in the past 20 years instead of 50 or 60 years ago. And Dust is pretty good. But then another game that I was thinking about a lot when we were playing it was Blood Rage. Eric Lang's Blood Rage.
Oh, yes.
Now, Blood Rage is a game I enjoy a lot, but it has a very strange thematic and mechanical position, which is it has this like very like kind of gory Adrian Smith like Viking theme, but the actual game it's a drafting game, right? It's weirdly like less combative than El Grande. And so in order to communicate its theme, it has to use this Adrian Smith art. It has to like comport itself on seriousness, because the actual game is a drafting game.
Right.
And when we were talking about the possibility of using this animal world, this kind of like Disney's Robin Hood style world, Red Wally world, that Kyle had been developing for Root, as soon as Kyle showed me his first sketches, it occurred to me that what we were doing was a really cute inversion of the Blood Rage formula, which is Blood Rage is a game that isn't that mean, that has a very mean theme.
Right.
And so the theming is like taking players to that immersive space. And what a cute theme would allow us to do is allow us as designers to make the game very mean and to kind of pull it the other way. And so we found that if we adopted this kind of like more cartoonish posture, players were just more comfortable being aggressive with one another.
Right.
And that isn't, I think that it's not to say that all games should be about conflict, but I found that the space of direct interaction was always a space that whenever I was walking around the floor of Gen Con, I always felt like there wasn't really a home for games like that. Like if you wanted to play an aggressive game, you had to sit down for 10 hours and play Twilight Imperium. And I was like, surely there are more people in this world than the folks who want to play Twilight Imperium like once a year, twice a year. And so out of that confluence came Root. But one of the reasons why I'm trying to emphasize things about like the art is that this conversation about what Root is and could be engaged on levels of like graphics and presentation and design in a very like twisted and tied way that is very different from a lot of other kind of game production.
Very, very cool. Speaking of the cute theme and the art, how did you come up with the 4 factions? And we're just talking the base game here. Marquis de Cats, the Eerie Dynasties, the Vagabond, and the Woodland Alliance. Where did the inspiration for those particular characters come from, and how they function in the gameplay.
So in coin games, there's always a government player. And I knew this game I wanted a government player. And then coin games sort of have this funny thing where there's like a government player and a chief antagonist. And then both the government and the antagonist have kind of like adjacent or orthogonal allies that are going to like want to help them, but they might be like more extreme in their tactics, or there might be some reason for friction between those two kind of natural allies. I think Andy and Abyss is probably the best example of that pairing. And so the very first factions. So Patrick's original proposal was vague on this point, but he. When I started sort of looking at the problem of an asymmetric strategy game, and that was going to be geared to 4 players. And the reason why it's 4 players, by the way, is mostly a cost issue, because we know that most people are going to be playing the game with 4 at the table, or 3.
Probably.
And wooden meeples that are screen printed are very expensive. So just as we're just trying to like cost the game and think about where it sits in our product in the product line, a 4-player game made sense. And then Patrick's original proposal was like, okay, we need a 4-player game, maybe a 5-player game. And so I sort of started from the perspective of the sort of coin pattern. The problem with that is there's a lot of subtlety in the way the factions are cast in coin games. And I knew that I needed like a blunter instrument for working with this theme, because if it's going to be cartoonish, there kind of like can't be 2 woodland alliances that have slightly different profiles. And in terms of the game's storytelling, it was important to me that the world be precise, but also general enough that players can project a wide range of ideologies and stories, because they're going to, I will never be as clever as the players, which is why in general, if I'm not making a historic game, I avoid proper nouns like entirely. I would much rather give players the precise descriptive words they need, but not do any of like the lore, because the players will build the lore up.
Yeah.
So when it came to the faction design, I was like, okay, there has to be a government player, and I want the government player to control the entire board. That was a very early thought behind how Root should work. And then I want there to be a player who's invading that space. And the reason for this is a thing about conflict games that I had observed, which is Twilight Imperium is a good example of this. At the beginning of Twilight Imperium, you're very far away from all the other players. So the first half of your game, you might not fire a shot. You're just taking planets and you're kind of building up. And then when people do start firing shots, they tend to have a lot of hurt feelings, because and I can't blame them, because the game was tricking them into thinking like, oh, this is a building game.
Right.
And then in the second half of the game, they're like, oh, this is a game about hurting people. I thought I spent 4 hours building. I'm not ready for the last 2 hours of this game to be fighty. And I thought about growing up, and I played a lot of Risk growing up. Okay. And one of the things that Risk does so well is when you start a game of Risk, the board is full. And there's no way to not fight someone at the very beginning of Risk. And in that way, Risk is very clear with its players about the kind of game it is. And so I thought, okay, I want there to be a player that owns the board and another player that is making an incursion. And I wanted some kind of programmatic way of doing the Eerie, because then they have like a step of deniability, right? So the Eerie would say, look, I had to move an attack because that's what my decree says I have to do. And it got players used to the idea of there are reasons why they have to attack each other that don't have to do with like what you did to me in the game of Splendor that we played earlier today, right? And so I wanted to kind of break out of that. And then there had to be an insurgent faction. But that only gave me 3 factions, and Patrick was very clear that he wanted 4. Now, in Patrick's proposal, he really liked the idea of there being an open world adventure component in the game. So he's like, one faction, one player position should be a single adventurer. And Patrick and I have both played a lot of Magic Realm, and Patrick is working on his like ode to Magic Realm, a game called Path that he's like forever working on, and maybe we'll do someday. Awesome. And so I proposed the idea of a vagabond character that kind of floated in between the factions and would have to be kind of a balancer. And Patrick liked the idea, and it answered with his concept. But I can say unequivocally that without Patrick, there would have been no vagabond character. Like that was initially, I was like, I don't know if this game is going to feel right. If one player has a single piece. And he was like, no, some people, when you sit down and play a strategy game, there might be somebody at the table who'd be rather playing an RPG or an open world game. And so we want that kind of role in the game. And so the vagabond kind of emerged out of that.
That's so cool.
That design stricture or something.
So how did you get from, you said this kind of came together in a month. How did you get from these initial ideas that were spinning into a playable prototype?
So I worked for the initial version of the game was basically like a long weekend of completely nonstop work.
Wow.
And I remember I asked my partner to watch the kids, and I said, like, okay, I have an idea, but I need like a lot of space to make sure it works. And I was thankful that I was able to get it. I do a lot of my own graphic design. At least for the initial passes. And then later on in the process, depending on the project, we'll bring in people to help with the graphics. And then now that we've grown, certainly we have several graphic designers on staff, or we have a couple. And so when it comes to a project, we divide out the graphic design when we can. But one thing that I pride myself on, and the biggest point of advice I give to young designers is really develop a mastery for a suite of graphics programs. It doesn't matter which ones. I use, Illustrator and Photoshop and InDesign, but really focus on how quickly can you iterate? How do you design a set of files for iteration, right? I mean, it's one thing to make a poster.
Yeah.
It's a whole other thing to make a poster that you're going to have to change 6 times a day for the next 3 weeks without the file. Just a giant mess. And I will tell you, the first edition of Pax Premier's Files, which is the first game I made professionally, are a complete disaster and a complete mess.
Oh, wow.
And they don't really even exist or work anyway in any meaningful way. So, one thing I always do, this exercise, where I go into Illustrator and I lay out artboards. And so I make an artboard is like a canvas, right? And so Illustrator allows you to sort of like lay out an artboard and look at several artboards at the same time. And then if you were to load that file as in a PDF viewer, it would arrange them as pages. And so usually when the first time I go off to make a game, the very first thing I'm trying to do is build a minimum viable prototype. I have to get it on the table as quickly as I can.
Sure.
And so I usually use the 5-page rule, which is a rule I'm coining and inventing right now, which is I have to fit the game onto 5 pages, 5 U.S. letter-sized pages.
Okay.
And so to do that, I usually have the page, or I usually have 1 or 2 pages for the board, 1 or 2 pages for the player boards, and then I make small versions of the game cards. And one of the files I sent you, you can see one of the, I think it's maybe 6 pages long, and it's all written. And I'm very, very quick. I'm just trying, if you're making like a big mural or something, you're just trying to sketch on the wall at first.
Sure.
And what I'm trying to do is like, okay, is there a way, what is the minimum size of a deck that I would need to see if my game will work? So maybe that's like only 20 cards. Right. Okay, let's find the 20 cards. Do I need the deck to be suited? Well, I think I do. So here are a suit for the different clearing types. I'm going to like make a simple deck of suited cards. I'm going to like give them some nonsense powers that I'm just kind of coming up with extemporaneously. Because the whole thing is I just have to get it on the table.
Right.
I cut everything out, I arrange it, I get some cubes there, and I just start playing it multi-handed and get a feel for how, like, what is the shape of the design space. And so, I mean, basically I think that is a really critical element of my creative process, that kind of like early high iteration, like scouting out. There is another element which is harder to do quickly, which is this like long incubation period. And that is really just, for me, it's like a lot of writing. I keep a design journal that I write in, a few times a week if I'm not working on anything that's in an active stage of development. And if I am working on something that's in active development, I write in it pretty much every day, where I basically, will say things like, hey, I played this game this afternoon. I didn't really like this one part. here's a thing I think that's a little different. Maybe this is another way of doing it.
That's cool.
And then I'll maybe do some spreadsheet modeling, very basic stuff where I just say like, can a game that uses victory points for scoring, can it be dramatic?
Yeah.
Okay, here's like a proof of a scoring structure, and I'll type it out and maybe make some different functions or something. Really, really basic, like this is high school math. And so all that stuff is just kind of like humming in the background. But then when it actually, like when the rubber hits the road, it's all about how quickly can I build a kit, get it to a table, and then just kind of play it, see if there's something there, and then go back to my kit, change it, iterate again. And so over that single weekend, I think I probably played 2 or 3 versions of the game that would become Root. And by the end of it, I thought, oh, there's like something here. It's like it's doing something that's different from a lot of other games. And it's funny looking at those early Root files because some things are almost unchanged from the final game. Right. And some things are completely different. It's like Root used to have this like very weird battle system that like didn't really work. But the movement rules and the rules for control and the idea of building structures, like all of that stuff, and the piece classes, the fact that you like have a warrior piece and a token and a building, those rules kind of never changed.
Okay, that's cool. Wow. So at what point, Cole, did you start documenting rules? Like you're kind of going through this period of iterating and just play testing yourself. Did you start documenting any rules, or did you kind of just have things in your head?
So okay, they're like, I love that question because there's a lot of different ways I want to answer it. Holding rules in your head is exhausting. And so I always think about the process of writing rules as this wonderful offloading where like I don't have to remember anymore. I can just push this into a document. And I also find that the actual writing of rules is tremendously clarifying because when you have to put something into a sentence, if you're having trouble wording that sentence, the problem actually might be with the rule itself.
Yeah.
And so I tend to write a first draft of rules like somewhat early in the process. It basically, as soon as I play a game and the changes are only like 10 or 20%, if the design is only changing, like 10% of the design is only being changed from game to game, I think, okay, now it's time to sit down and write the rules. And I view rule writing and designing as like really two sides of the exact same coin. And one thing that has changed at Leader Games over the course that I've been here is we involve our rules editor, Josh Yearsley, earlier and earlier in the process. And he's now a staff member of the company. And so basically, as soon as something is stable, I want to get Josh in there because Josh has a great mind for rules. And I also I love collaborating, but I'm also really picky. Like I like writing rules. I don't want someone to take that from me. But I do let Josh take it from me. And I like having him in the process because he will encounter something and say, hey, this concept, which actually seems easy, when you put it into a rule, it's quite complicated. And so I could write the paragraph version of this rule, but maybe we should just change it. And because we're all involved in this process together, I can take that advice very seriously. Yeah. It's much more common in the industry for you to bring in a rules editor at the very, very end. And at which point you can't change the game. You've already done all the testing.
Right.
So I think that there is, for me, rules writing is best done early and often, and shouldn't be thought of as not creative, right? So I think there's this tendency, and I know this even among established designers, people say like, "Oh, I hate writing rules; it's never gotten easier." And I think they see it as work, like cleaning up the kitchen after they spend all the time cooking. And I'm like, no, actually, the rules writing is like the writing of the recipe.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of creativity and a lot of design work that happens at the level of rules writing. And so I really like that process. The other thing that I'll say about that is when I'm working on a project, I think very seriously about complexity budgets. And I imagine myself as having so many words allocated to me to design a particular type of game. And so, if I'm writing a rule and I'm like, wow, we're spending a lot of words to explain this concept, is this concept load bearing? Is it actually interesting? Or should we kick it to the side? And even in the more complicated games that I've done, I try to apply that thinking because it's so easy when you're working on a big complicated game to give yourself an excuse to let the rule book get an extra page. Yeah. And I'm like, no, every single rule has to be load bearing. It has to be, holding more than its own weight.
That's awesome. And yeah, I know the rule book for Root is great, and I love having the Learn to Play guide. I love that in the coin games too, and a lot of the GMT war games.
Well, and I also think that like something else about rules writing and about that kind of like the way you approach design. I think I tend so. There's a classic question I always get asked about design, which is, do you start with the theme or the mechanism? Mm-hmm. And I kind of hate this question, but I also know that like for me the answer is it's not either. It's like I start with the idea of the system, which is informed by the theme. So I like. You and I are going to sit down to play a game, Candice, and I know what relationship I want to have between our two player positions. I don't know any of the mechanisms. Mm-hmm. I might know the theme, but what I have is like the system. And so when I'm working on a design, I love to work at the medium shot where and to do like the same way I think when Kyle talks about composition, I spend a lot of time thinking about composition when it comes to game mechanisms because I'm thinking about, okay, what feeling am I trying to generate here?
Yeah.
How am I going to arrange these systems? And that might mean that like, this part actually should be a deck builder for this reason, or it should be a worker placement game for that reason. When it comes to playtesting and things, sometimes I can exhaust my testers because I am like changing mechanisms very, very frequently because I'm trying to get the shot to be composed the way I want to compose it.
That sounds like a great approach, and I think that's one of the reasons a lot of the games you've designed, I mean, especially the ones that I've played, are so different, and because you're coming at it from a different angle like that.
I think it's the core reason, like, folks sometimes tell me that my games are hard to learn, which I think is a fair cop. I don't get prickly about it. But weirdly, and I know this just because I have access to the back end, one of the weird things that I see in the reception of my games is that people who play a lot of games often find them a little tricky to learn. But people who don't play that many games don't think of them as any harder to learn than any other new game. And I think what's happening is that a lot of games, like if I sit down to play the new Uwe Rosenberg game, I like hardly need to read the rules. And it's no criticism on Uwe's work. It's awesome.
Right.
But like when we sat down in the office and played Nusfjord somewhat recently, I looked at the board and then I asked a few questions and we were ready to go. Like it just kind of like I just knew how it was going to work.
Sure.
And I think like nothing in Root will prepare you to play Pamir, and nothing in Pamir will prepare you to play Oath, and certainly nothing in any of those games will really prepare you for the new issue of John Company. And I just like it isn't. I think of this very much as when I'm working, like it's a trade-off. I don't think of it as a good thing. I don't get any delight from being cute about making my games obscure. Instead, I think about it like I want this freedom of composition. Yeah. And the cost of that is that the games are a little harder to learn.
Yeah.
And I'm like very grateful to have found an audience that's comfortable paying that cost.
Yeah.
Because I like that's just kind of the place, the manner in which I feel the most comfortable working.
What was your process for playtesting Root?
Playtesting is really tricky. I know Jeff Eggleston. I really admire a lot of his writing on games. And sometimes I wonder if I would ever write something about game design, I would want to write about playtesting and how to run development. This process is different for everyone, but there are a few places where it is as divergent as how people run their playtesting. It's amazing. When I was in college, I did some playtesting for some well-regarded game companies that had a horrible experience, and didn't. I don't know. They just kind of wanted me to say that it was good, and I didn't feel like I was really, participating in the process. So I'll speak specifically about Root, and then I'll say a couple of general things about problems that people run into commonly with Root. I had a small cadre of playtesters that I had that had been with me with John Company, and some of them all the way since the first edition of Pax Pamir. Not very many of them had worked on Infamous Traffic. That's because Infamous Traffic was really just a closed project. Like I built it with my group and my brother's group, and those were the only people who played that game. And that can be a perfectly okay way to design a game. In fact, I think it's so interesting learning more about the history of like, a game like Princes of Florence or one of like the big, elder Euro games. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes they were tested by very small groups of people. And so my general thing has been to be very careful about my playtesters. And I really want people who think critically and who are interested in the kinds of work that they were doing. They feel like they have some say and some stake in it. And then the really, really important thing is to make sure that you don't actually stock your playtesters with people who just loved your stuff. Fans are wonderful, but sometimes they can mess with the perception of the game. And so there's a thing that happens with playtesting groups where as the longer a playtesting group will be around, the more critical voices go away. Because the only people sticking around are like the true fans. Yeah. And so you can really easily trick yourself into making something that isn't very good because it's good for the narrow slice that already likes your work. So I try to be very careful about the people that I bring into playtesting and the ones that I want to carry over from one project to another. I moved to Minnesota. I didn't really have any groups to play with. So a lot of my playing was with the office group. Okay. Which was myself, the founder of the company, the sales manager, the director of operations. Us four. Okay. Playing Root every day, once or twice. For months. For months and months. And then on certain days, I would go to a game store called The Source and play with members of the First Minnesota Wargaming Group, which is a group that is very well established. They've been around since I think like the 80s. Cool. They're great. I mean, it's an amazing club because you'll go visit them, and there'll be like 3 games of Sekigahara being played at once, and like every week. Love it. And so I played Root with them, and then my brother was living in Chicago with a close friend of mine, and he played a lot. And then outside of those 2 centers, I had about 3 playtesting groups that were just people who had helped me with John Company. One of them was a man named Grayson Page, who's based in the Mid-Atlantic region. And he played a lot of Root, and his group was like instrumental in making it as good as it is. And the main thing he offered is he was merciless in his feedback. I would get an email from Grayson like, "Oh my God, I need a stiff drink." Like just this brutal takedown. But it was great because he brought a lot of like focus. And he has since gone on to develop lots of games for GMT. He's helped me on many different projects. Oh. And so, basically then as the Kickstarter happened, we were able to bring in more people and people started playing the public print and play kits. And then I sort of boosted the size of our testing. But much of Root's testing was fundamentally internal. Okay. Now, when it came to feedback, I use a variety of like Google Forms to just record like who's winning, who's losing. But a lot of that feedback isn't terribly useful because the game changes so much that like if I back out and say like, out of these 1,000 games I have recorded, I know this faction wins this amount of time, that faction wins that amount of time. That database is really imperfect because it's not comparing apples and apples. It's comparing apples and oranges. Right. And it kills me. Honestly, this is like a pet peeve of mine. I see established designers all the time talk about the data they're getting back from playtesters. And I'm like, I wish you would have taken like one class on like designing a study. Because the data you're getting, like, do not ask your playtesters to rate the game. That's a nonsense thing to ask. And so there are all these ways that you can collect really bad data. And so the main thing that I want to get out of playtesters is not the data. The main thing I want is what is the conversation like around the game? What, if someone says, this is broken or this unbalanced, like, okay, great, let's have an argument. Yeah. And that the strength of that argument is so valuable. Now, and I know we're talking mostly about Root, but when we got to Underworld, we had to change our approach a little bit, which is we had that same tight inner cadre to do the early stages of the design. And then when it came to balancing, we knew that what we needed was a lot of plays, just a lot of data. And so we actually hired a bunch of people to come into our studio, and I felt like I was running a little college class. I'd come in and I had my little, and I wish I had one laying around, but I would give everybody like their assignments for the day, and I would say, okay, you're going to be playing, these games, fill out these reports, and then at the end of the day, I would put all those reports into a spreadsheet, and we would have a little development meeting about the data from that day. And one of the things I loved about that experience is we got all kinds of people, a lot of people from the university. Not very many of them were gamers. We had some folks who were associated with the local game store, but we also had students and just people who were interested generally in the process. And I remember the very first day when I had them all in there, I said, how many games of Root have you played? And, some people had played once or twice. And then one guy in the back raised his hand. He's like, oh, I've played Root a lot. I've played maybe 10 times. And I said, great. But everyone, by the end of like the third day, everybody here will have played more Root than this guy in the corner. So, like, I know he's coming at you with, like, a lot of gravitas and experience, but, like, 10th place is not a lot for the kind of work that we're doing. And it was great because by the end, many of those groups could play 4 or 5 times a day because, they were doing it full time for a week and a half or so. And so, like, when it comes to developing new Root content, the challenges of balancing all the content are steeper and steeper, which means our testing infrastructure has to be able to pivot from an infrastructure that's very good at designing systems to a system that's very good at evaluating the integrity of a system, which is a different kind of question. It's a lot more like video game testing or like product testing.
What were some of the biggest challenges you and the team at Leader faced throughout the design and development process of Root?
Oh, Root was hard. I remember when Root was done, I told my wife that I felt like I had just designed 6 games, and I wanted a long cool down after it was over. One of the trickiest things about Root was that whenever you fixed one thing, you automatically broke another thing. Yeah. So I was always designing in this like loop where I'm like, oh, I finally got this faction working. Oh no, that really messes with this faction. Then I have to go. Root is one of the most uneven designs when it comes to the labor that was involved. So the Erie had basically 2 versions. There was an early version which had this like grow, collapse, turmoil system that never really worked the way it was supposed to work. And then I was like more or less design jamming. I had a friend from out of town visit me and come to work with me. And he was like, hey, do you want to just talk through what you're designing? And I was like, okay. And so I just talked through a complete rebuild of the Erie that was the decree system that we went with. Once that decree system occurred, the Erie had basically no changes for their entire development. We would like adjust a value or adjust a power a little bit, but they were pretty much. The Woodland Alliance, on the other hand, took so long because they are the faction of bad feelings. They make everybody hate them. And I needed them to be impactful, but in a way that was also contributing to the story, but that wasn't, like too frustrating for the other players to deal with. And it just took a long time to figure out exactly how they should work. They went through lots and lots of iterations, and they were one of the last factions to be like truly locked in.
Did you have any aha moments when you were designing Root where you had something that was just like, yeah, this is great, things are working?
There were like a couple. So one of the ones I think about is Root used to have this like multi-stage battle system, which I really liked. I am, if there's one thing that I have yet to like learn better than, is I always design a too complicated battle system and then replace it with something very stripped down. When I changed Root to the 0 through 3 double dice combat system, it immediately felt good. And it was so clear that it was almost producing the same outputs as the old system, but it took a fraction of the time. It felt so clean. And I remember playing those games and thinking like, okay, this game is like good in a way that I haven't played another game that does what this game is doing. Then there were these other moments too. I mean, the whole time we were working on Root, I think a lot of studios and a lot of individual designers, they dream of winning to Spiel, or they like have some very like high idea of like they want to, become one of the pillars of Asmodee, right? They want to produce a real bestseller. And that's never been the business model at Leader. We have our audience. We love when our audience grows. That's great. But we are making games for them and just want to make them happy. And so with Root, I remember always thinking like, boy, I have no idea if people are going to like this thing that we're making, right? Mm-hmm. But there were these little hints that we were onto something where playtesters would sometimes ask to take the kits home with them after our Wednesday night open playtesting nights, where they're like, can I take this? I kind of want to play with my Saturday group. Or like Patrick would say like, oh yeah, I kind of want to play Root tonight with my like home game group. And that is always a good sign, because especially if you're working on a game, you do not want to take that game home in the evening.
Yeah.
Right. So there were moments in the reception that started feeling good, and there were a couple moments in the design where things just kind of like snap together.
The combat system, the battling in Root that you came up with, or you guys as a team came up with, is awesome, because it's very easy to understand, and I don't know, it's still exciting. I do enjoy rolling some dice.
One thing I'll say about the combat system is it's a good example of my process, because I went into that combat system knowing what the variance was going to be and what the attacker advantage was going to be. And so I was like, I need to come up with a system that has about this much variance and has about this much advantage to the attacker. And I went through a bunch of different systems, and the resulting one was the one that best met those criteria. But it wasn't like I had like dice that I was just kind of like trying to feed. I wasn't very intuitive about that at all. I was almost mercenary, where I was like, okay, how do you with 2 dice create this result? Okay, you can do it like this. So it's very high concept first, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally. You kind of touched on some of the graphic design, how you started it, and you guys at Leader have a team of different people now that kind of work on graphic design. Man, Kyle's art is so great, and it's like so unique and signature. It's one of my favorite games art by far. I love the different creatures and the way the map looks and everything. How were some of those decisions made in terms of like the art and the graphic design choices you guys made for the final version?
So most people who work here, can I say most? I think it is most, have some graphic design background. So that's cool. we've all we all know our way around the Adobe Suite. And I think, those that might not have as much expertise there also have like opinions about art and look and things like that. So whenever we have a meeting about these things, there's a lot of voices. But Kyle's real special, because even though he is known in the board game space as an illustrator, his career before that was as a graphic designer. And Kyle understands, even when he's not doing the graphic design for a game, like not actually doing the layout, maybe would be the better word, he is really thinking about how something should look and how it should present itself. And he has this very important idea, which is something that we both talked about a lot and we saw completely eye to eye on when it comes to the look of the game, which is that a game should look as if it exists in the world in which it's being in which it is portraying. There's a term for it, like deco utility or something. I'm going to mess it up. I can't remember the name of the term. But it's important that, with Root, that the meeples, the shape of the meeples, the style of the map, all that stuff kind of look like the characters in Root could be playing a game of Root. And one of it struck me so much about Vast when I first started working with him that he had adopted that strategy. And I loved that Kyle, he talks a lot about like the inherent charm of the medium, which is all the imperfections of something that is hand-drawn, inked, and then colored. And even though he colors digitally, he uses watercolor textures that he makes himself. And so there is this hand-drawn element that, it wouldn't look like Root. I love some of the fan minis that people have made for Root, but Root is not a game for miniatures. It needs those wooden pieces. And so, when we were talking about the graphic design for the game, I presented Kyle with the first draft of the card layout. And I was like, hey, I want these cards to be very simple. So, in a Fantasy Flight game, everything is immersive. It's all very realist. It looks like you got some stained paper.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's amazing to look at a card from the Arkham card game and just try to ask yourself, how many layers are there in this file? And it's a lot. It's like 80, right? It is a ton. Just all the little tiny details, right? And with Kyle, I said, playability is very important to me. And so, what matters about this card? It's suit. So it's going to have a color bar, and it'll have an icon. And I want it clean, simple, simple, simple. And Kyle loves that, kind of less is more graphic design, but then being very careful with, what elements of each design do you embellish, right? And so I'll tell a couple little stories about the look of Root. We had a very long conversation about what the warrior pieces should be, because we had never done screen printed meeples before, and at this time they were even a little bit more expensive and kind of hard to do. And so we went through a lot of different things. And there were some people at the company who really wanted miniatures, miniature packs, and there were other people like myself who wanted some kind of stackable wooden piece. And then we started talking about meeples, and I said, okay, meeples are great, but my biggest problem with meeples is that people try to make them in scale. So a good example is Martin Wallace's Gettysburg or Waterloo, where it has meeples, but they're kind of tall, soldiery looking. But the problem with that is when you look at a bunch of them, the board's incomprehensible, because it's it's too many. This is such a maybe a silly thing to say. There are almost too many lines, because if you think about every line and every outline is this person's musket and their bayonet is getting a little outline. You need a simpler shape, and then also the problem with a lot of meeple shapes is they fall over, and so you need something a little more abstract. And so after I talked about it with Kyle went to his sketchpad. One of his sketchpad pages has all of the different Root meeples on it. That is the first time they're ever drawn. And Kyle, he went through and he created these meeple shapes. And then as soon as we saw them, it was obvious. It was absolutely obvious that was the way to go. Awesome. Something else that's funny that happened about the graphic design of the game is, I have been working on the graphic design mostly because I'm making the playtesting kits. When I'm working on a game, I want to make my own iterative process. I call it the iterative loop, right? My iterative loop, I want it to be as tight a belt as I can get it. Right, I want it to be as small as possible, and so I don't want to have to send my files to person X, who will send them to person Y, who will send them back to me. I want to and so I have been working all through the development and working on the graphic design of the game in collaboration with Kyle, and eventually, as we were working on Root, we were trying to get it ready for Gen Con of that year. And it became clear that we couldn't really afford to outsource the graphics. It would take too long. And so we just kind of decided to go with the prototype graphics that I had been working in. So I polished them up a little bit. But, Root looks a lot like its late stage prototypes, because we just ended up going with a simpler graphical look. And then the last thing I'll say about the look in the graphics is I care a lot about typography and the book arts. My partner studied the book arts and is really interested in book binding and book forms. And I have spent a lot of my life learning about books. And so one thing that bums me out, this is another big pet peeve, is a lot of folks, when they're laying out a rule book, the first question a company asks themselves is, how big is the box? Let's just make the rule book the exact same size as the box. And that giant square, and I know you know what I'm talking about, is the most unnatural shape to read in the world. Even when you break it into columns, it's horrible. It's just it is. I sound like I don't know. It's very pretentious to say this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. It is the most unfriendly reading shape, and there's just no there's no beauty to it. There's no beauty to it. So when we were laying out the Root rulebook, we hit upon, I was working very briefly with a graphic designer named Jamie Williams, who we contracted very, very briefly to work on a couple of Root elements. And she and I were talking, and I told her like, hey, because of some children's books that are set in Baskerville, I really want to use a Baskerville cut for the game's typeface. I want to give it like a kind of classic mid like a late 19th century feel, and I want that to be presented in the rule books. And so I told her that the Learn to Play, the law can be letter sized. It's a legalistic document. It can have like some hefted size to it, but the Learn to Play needs to be smaller. As if it's being held by like the hands of a child, right?
Yeah.
And she had the idea, and I thought this was a great idea, and I wish I would have had it myself, to make Learn to Play the ratio of the Learn to Play should mimic that of the little golden books.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Golden books. And then
awesome.
For the fourth printing of the game, we made a little walkthrough booklet, which a lot of people who've been playing Root, who started playing when Root came out, have never actually even seen this booklet. I wish I had one. Here, hold it for the screen. We made this. Yeah, so there's that. But then also...
Oh, you're talking about... Let me see.
I'm going to look for... Oh, I've got one right here. Actually, this one's very special. I'll tell you about it in a second. So the most recent printing has this book, which is it's a chapbook for folks who know that format. So sometimes people publish these like zines will be a chapbook format or like a little book of poems.
Yeah.
And so extended walkthrough has, lots of pictures in it and, animal art in it. But it sits, I'm just going to see if I have all the files here. Like here's a Learn to Play. And then here's the little chapbook. It's a little cute chapbook. One fun note about this particular chapbook, I don't know if the camera will catch it. There's a little string right here. My wife saddle stitched this because testing it. I wanted to see like really what it would feel and look like. And she was watching me work and struggle with a stapler. And she's like, let me just saddle stitch that real fast. And
that's cool.
So we get like as if it's a book. The game that we've been working on this past year, Oath, adopts a similar strategy when it comes out to how it lays its rule book. So it uses a very non-traditional rule book size, but it's because that size is very natural for reading.
Wow. That's really awesome. I never really thought about, people putting so much effort and thought into the rule book, but, it's another thing that just adds to the whole look and feel of the game and the experience and the vibe, the overall vibe of Root.
I tend to think of like every single component in a game box is a barrier to play, even the pretty ones.
Yeah.
So, every single component presents a barrier, but then also an enticement. There are some rule books that are just like beautiful objects. And one of the games that really inspired me in this regard is a game by GMT called Unhappy King Charles, which is a very like hoary and weird war game about the English Civil War. It is one of the strangest, for even people who play a lot of war games, it is a very strange war game. But it has the most beautiful rule book that is laid out like a 17th century book. And it's gorgeous. Cool. And I remember like I was kind of bouncing off the title, not sure what to do with it. And then someone had taught me, and then I sat down and read the rule book myself. And was just so charmed by the experience of reading it and thought, okay, every piece might be a barrier to play, but every piece could also like hook you in.
Yeah. Wow, that's really cool. And I've never heard of that GMT game, so I'm going to have to check it out.
It's out of print. I'm sorry.
No!
They'll republish it someday.
Cole, how did you come up with the name of Root?
There is some internal debate about this. I think I originated it, but I'm not sure. Okay. So for a while, the game was called Rule, which I definitely originated, and which I hated as a name. So, and I'll explain why in a second. So Bass was out, and there was no rule at Leader that said that our titles had to be 4 letters. But it kind of seemed like they should be. And so I was working... I had like, I think Rule even had the game's subtitle, the game of Woodland Might and Right. Like that tag, or that, I think about it as a subtitle. Patrick thinks about it as like a marketing tag. I don't really care. It's on the box. That's all I care about. But that tag was there, and then I had the game's name, Rule. But the problem with the word Rule is it's got this weird I don't know. I'm not a linguist, so I don't know the exact name for the way the U is sounding. That the shape. It's just like if people are murmuring in a room,
yeah,
and someone says the name rule, you may not realize that they're even saying that word, right?
Yeah.
And so I just like how it sounded. I don't know. I get fidgety about names like that.
Sure.
And so we were thinking about it a lot. We had a bunch of different names. I think I suggested Root in that brainstorm because it was, to me, it did something really important, which that it had a metaphorical resonance. It's about like the roots of power, but also like there are trees.
Yeah.
And it was working on a couple different registers, and I was arguing for it. And then Kyle picked up on it and latched onto it in a huge, huge way. And without his blessing, it certainly wouldn't have happened. And at that point, so I think Kyle really latched onto it. And then when he was working on the game's art, he was like, let's put a big root right in the middle of the box. And, there's even I think I might have sent you the draft of what the card backs was going to look like. It's like with a bunch of roots on it. And so I don't know, it just kind of fired the imagination because I don't want a name to be like too prescriptive. I think sometimes I look at a name of a board game and it's like, the so-and-so of so-and-so, the Galactic Rebellion of like 325. And I'm like, this is so specific. I want the game to spark the imagination and not to be the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of the conversation. And so that's actually one reason why I love the 4-letter naming convention, because I think it forces us to work within constraints and to search for words that are going to evoke so many kind of interesting, like, adjacent ideas.
Very cool. And root also just sounds cool.
I agree.
Rule.
Yeah, root is bad. It's quite bad.
How did you know when root was finished? I know you were saying you were kind of pushing to get it out by Gen Con. Did you have any kind of deadline?
We had a deadline. I was working. So over the course of Root, I worked like a maniac. I was just telling this to someone who was a recent hire at the company. I would come in usually around 7:30 in the morning and work till 5 or 6. Go home, do dinner with the kids, bedtime, play with them a little bit, and then I'd go back to work from 8:30 to like 11 each night.
Oh no!
It was crazy.
Wow.
But in the back of my mind, I was thinking we have to have these files into the factory by March. Because if we can get them by March, then the game will come out in Gen Con. And this is a game that could really benefit from a Gen Con release. And so at a certain point, I pride myself on the ability to like project manage and hit deadlines. And that means that sometimes you have to throw things off the boat to get it to go faster, right? And so, it never felt like I never had the feeling of like it was done. It was the way I would phrase that is I knew that it had to be finished by a certain time. And I should say that Patrick is a very gracious employer. And if I would have told him like, hey, this game really needs an extra month or an extra 2 months, there would have been not a complaint in the world, right? And in fact, when it came to Oath, we were running very ahead of schedule when we were working on Oath, but there was some things that I wanted to revisit and some art pieces that we were working on. And I said, Patrick, I want an extra 3 months. And he was like, of course, you can take as long as you need. So that being said, we did stop changing it. I remember very clearly like the last few games that we played in the studio where the game was done. It felt done. And I remember playing, we played a game on the winter map with a very weird faction mix, like the lizards and some other factions were in there. And it went 12 turns, which is a very long root game. Most root games are like 7. But what would happen was like the board was like totally destroyed. There had been a bunch of favorite cards played. Everyone had like 23 points, but no one had the ability to get to close the deal with like the last few points. And it felt so good. And I remember thinking after the game we were talking about it, and I was like, I have no idea if this game's going to do well, but that was amazing. That was like post-apocalyptic Root. And I don't think I have anything else I want to change about this design. And it was a very nice like little end cap to that period of frenzied work. And then of course we did, one last little thing I'll mention is we finished the game. We submitted the files to our factory. And then we all went to PAX East. And we played it at PAX East. And before we went there, I've got a prop I can show you.
Yay! Love props.
You can edit out my. Oh my gosh, what is this prop? It's like right here. It's always right here. I'm gonna look for like one more second. If I don't find it, I'll just forget. Wow, that's crazy. I don't understand where I can put this thing. It is like always sat in this exact spot.
Oh, Space Empires, nice.
Oh yeah.
Oh, you have so awesome. Oh man, you have a great game collection.
You can see I've got it's Warrior Knights. I got a copy of Blood Rage. This a very good gift from a friend, Old Borderlands. This game is just crazy. If you want to know what the common ancestor of roads and boats in Catan is.
Very cool.
Okay, I found it. So for PAX East, this is a funny thing. I didn't mean to bring this up. So for PAX East, I printed this little binder. I felt like I was preparing a report, right, as a kid. So there's a root final files. And I printed everything in the game, like this, And then whenever we had a problem during the PAX East tests, we would say, this is a weird line that people are misreading. Okay. So let's definitely fix that. And we had a little index up here at the front. One funny thing. So here, let's see if I can find some late stage changes. So here's one. The Woodland Alliance sympathy track, you'll see right here.
Yeah.
And it has a problem where it was too small and the counters hit each other. So if you look on your board, we made them bigger and then put them in a zigzag so they would fit. But we went through the whole game. And in fact, there was another weird sizing error, like the victory track, which fits right at the end. And I remember coming home on the plane with this binder, reviewing everything, and looking at the changes and thinking, we can make these changes in about an hour. And it's done. It's like we are done. And it had there was such finality to it. And it's funny because every project I've worked on has had a different feel, and Root has been the one that had like the cleanest cutoff, where it was like the files are in, everything's on time, we're done. Which is of course quite funny because Root is the one that I've been tinkering the most and have worked on the most after it's been released. Right.
So Cole, do you have any advice for game designers out there or aspiring game designers who are thinking about making a game that has asymmetric factions?
So if you're trying to design a game with asymmetric factions, the biggest thing that I would ask you about your game is to make sure that the game needs such a thing. Asymmetric factions put a lot of pressure on a player. Your game is going to be hard to teach. People are going to complain about the fact that even though they learned how to play it last week, they now have to relearn it. And so be prepared for that. And you need to be giving them something special. You need to be giving something that is going to reward that effort. So, one thing I usually tell, I kind of have like two bits of advice for folks who are just starting out. One is to try to own all of your processes. Try to learn as much about how game design works as you possibly can. And that includes like teaching yourself some graphic design and making yourself kind of an independent operator. And then the other piece of advice is that try to make something urgent and be willing to defend your thing for what it is. And when it comes to designing something, maybe it has a strange action structure or all of the roles play a different way. There's no wrong way to make a game, but you want to build something that advances the state of the art, that makes the conversation richer for the inclusion of your voice, right? And that's a really wonderful burden to take. And so when you're thinking about asymmetric factions and things like that, Root I hope Root's not the last word on asymmetric factions. I'm always happy when I see more other designs working in that space. And so, if you find yourself wanting to work in that space, I think just make sure that you're holding your work to a high standard, because you are your own best critic. and don't let anybody tell you that you always need to, be critical, or you always need to be like happy and supportive of your work. Look at what you're doing very honestly and ask yourself about the things that it's adding to the conversation and the places where maybe it's not and can be revised.
That is some sound advice. Well, thanks again so much, Cole, for joining me today. It was really awesome to have you break down the design process for Root. There's already a decent amount of content out there for Root, expansions with different unique factions, different maps, cards, and I know there's more on the way, which I'm really looking forward to. Also looking forward to playing some Oath and, seeing John Company 2nd edition and pretty much anything with your name on it in the future. I am going to be super curious and excited to play. So thank you again for being here today.
It is my pleasure. And I'll say, every project I've worked on, there's always this pregnant pause right at the end of a project where you've played it so much and you've enjoyed the project so much, but no one else has played it. And there is nothing better than the feeling of finally getting something into people's hands and letting them explore it for themselves. So I'm just immensely grateful that there's all those folks who are wanting to play such strange games. One kind of cap to the whole story of Root is, every game, every year there's going to be a breakout game or a few breakout games. And that's never something I'm trying to do. But it was so heartening in the Gen Con, the 2018 Gen Con, walking around the hallways outside of the convention hall and seeing people squatting over their copies of Root, playing on the floor because Gen Con famously doesn't have a lot of table space where you can just play games. So there was people sitting in the hallways playing Root and rolling dice and moving pieces around and shouting and laughing. And, there's no single way to make a game that's going to be a breakout, but just speaking as somebody who loves immersive, story-driven, interactive games, it was heartening to see that there's still a big audience for games like that. And so I just say, for all those folks out there thinking about making their own game, don't let anybody tell you, there isn't an audience for a certain type of game. Just make the game of your dreams, and maybe there'll be an audience, and maybe there won't. But when all's said and done, you still got to make the thing.
Awesome. Thanks, Cole. Thank you all for watching Cardboard Creations. Hopefully it's been as inspiring and fascinating for you as it has been for me. And remember, the only way to get something done is to start doing it.